Halloween is supposed to be a night of innocent scares, plastic skeletons, fake cobwebs, children giggling in superhero costumes. It's a night where monsters are make-believe and fear is just for fun. But on October 31st, 2012, in a quiet Michigan trailer park, something truly evil walked through an unlocked door, and an unsuspecting family, preparing for trick-or-treating like any other, would be forever shattered by someone they never thought not to fear. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too. You sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Today we're doing a little bonus episode, a little mini bonus episode, because it is spooky season, and what is spook-ie are than real-life monsters. Literally nothing. But this case is... it's a doozy. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this Halloween crime case together. Born on March 26, 1988, in Midland, Michigan, Rebecca grew up as one of her children in the Gay family. Her parents, Thomas and Sally Gay, raised her alongside her brothers James and Darren and her sister Deborah. And from an early age, Rebecca showed a gentle spirit and caring nature that would define her entire life. At Bullock Creek High School, where she graduated in 2007, teachers and classmates remembered her as a quiet, pretty girl with a very generous heart. And she also joined the equestrian team, channeling her love for animals, and volunteered for the school's archery shoot fundraiser, an event designed to help families facing tragedy. That sense of putting others first would become her defining characteristic. Superintendent Charlie S.C.H. Wedler would later recall her as a sweet, sweet girl, a simple description that captured the essence of who Rebecca was. Even as a teenager, she was already planning her career path, studying cosmetology while still in high school. And after graduation, she completed her training at In-Session School of Cosmetology, ready to pursue her passion for helping people feel beautiful. But Rebecca's world changed forever when she became a mother to Conway Cliff Kelly, who was born around 2009. So at just 21 years old, she found herself navigating single motherhood, but those who knew her said she embraced it with her whole heart, and Conway became her pride and joy, the center of her universe. Every night without fail, Rebecca followed the same loving routine, story time, then prayers with Conway before bed. And her Bible and devotional sat on the nightstand next to her bed, just a testament to her deep Christian faith that guided her through life's challenges. Her family would describe her as totally devoted to her son and very family-oriented, caring for others before herself. She was a very hands-on mother who made sure Conway felt loved and secure, despite the challenges of single parenthood. She maintained a cooperative relationship with Conway's father as well, also a Midland resident, ensuring her son had consistent time with both parents. So a hard worker chasing stability, Rebecca worked as a stylist at Bore Ickes Hair Care, using the skills she'd learned in cosmetology school to build her career. But like many single mothers, she needed more stability and better hours to balance work with raising Conway. So in 2012, she made the difficult decision to leave her cosmetology career and took a job at the Goodwill store in Mount Pleasant. It wasn't glamorous work, but Rebecca approached it with the same dedication she brought to everything else, and her work ethic didn't go unnoticed. By October 2012, she had been promoted to a management position. So clearly, her hard work and dedication was paying off. To make her commute easier and to save money, Rebecca moved to a mobile home in Broomfield Valley Trailer Park on Coldwater Road in Broomfield Township, Isabella County, about 11 miles west of Mount Pleasant. The trailer park was modest, but Rebecca made it a home for herself and Conway. Those closest to Rebecca described her in remarkably consistent terms. Her mother Sally called her the family's heart and soul, and co-workers at Goodwill found her reliable and hardworking. By fall of 2012, Rebecca's life was looking brighter than ever because, on top of everything else, getting a new home and getting a new job and getting a promotion, she actually found love again with her Aunt Quinn, and soon the two were engaged to be married. So she was building a blended family, looking forward to a future that included both Conway and Aaron. And she was succeeding at her job, providing stability for her son, and surrounded by family who adored her. Even her nieces and nephews looked up to their Aunt Rebecca, who always made time for them as well. So all in all, life was looking really good for Rebecca and her new family. And one of their favorite holidays was coming up, and that was Halloween. So October 31st, 2012 should have been a magical day. Because that Halloween season, Rebecca decorated with 8 scarecrows and hung pictures of pumpkins and other festive decorations, creating a warm, cheerful environment for her 3-year-old son, who was very excited to trick or treat. And she'd made plans with Aaron to take 3-year-old Conway trick or treating that evening. It was supposed to be one of those perfect family moments. A young mother watching her little boy's face light up as he collected candy in his Halloween costume, building memories that would last a lifetime. But she would have to work that day, cause she was actually scheduled to work at Goodwill during that day, and then come home and get Conway ready for his first real Halloween adventure with his mom and her fiancé. She had the whole costume ready, and the plans were set. But unfortunately, Rebecca never made it to work on October 31st, 2012. So when Rebecca didn't show up for her shift at the Goodwill store that Halloween morning, her co-workers knew immediately something was wrong. This wasn't like her. Rebecca was reliable, dedicated, never one to miss work without calling. So concerned, a co-worker drove to her trailer in the Broomfield Valley trailer park to check on her, and what they found was unsettling. Rebecca's car was still there, the door to her mobile home locked, and her purse sat on the counter completely untouched. Rebecca was gone, and so was her 3-year-old son Conway. The eerie silence where there should have been the sounds of a mother and child preparing for Halloween sent chills through everyone who learned it. So police work called immediately, and the Isabella County Sheriff's Department launched a missing persons investigation. Deputies began canvassing the trailer park area, knocking on doors, asking neighbors when they'd last seen Rebecca. The timeline they pieced together was thin, cause she'd last been seen the previous evening, October 30th, and now more than 12 hours later, she had vanished without a trace. As word spread through the small community, concern turned to fear. Pastor John D. White, who was engaged to Rebecca's mother Sally Gay, stood before his congregation at Christ Community Fellowship Church and asked the 14 members to pray for Rebecca's safe return. Sally Gay, Rebecca's mother, was just beside herself with worry, desperately hoping her daughter would walk through the door at any moment. Then came a small relief in a growing nightmare. Conway was actually found safe by John White, and John, knowing that Conway's father was very worried about him, dropped Conway off at the biological father's work, which was at the Midland Major grocery store. The police were called, and luckily Conway was unharmed, but he couldn't tell anyone where his mother was. He was only 3 years old, after all. So for 20 agonizing hours, Rebecca's family clung to hope, cause maybe she had just gone somewhere, and maybe there was an explanation, and maybe she would come home. Sally Gay prayed desperately, begging God to bring her daughter back safely. Initially, police had few leads. They questioned neighbors and Rebecca's fiancé, Aaron Quinn, and her ex-boyfriend. Basically anyone who might have had contact with her. But there was another name that came up, and that was John White, the 55-year-old pastor who was engaged to Rebecca's mother. So police naturally started to look into who he was, and what they found was pretty shocking. The congregation at Christ Community Fellowship and the community in general thought they knew Pastor White. He preached about redemption, about being born again, about how God could change anyone. And he often told them, quote, "We need to check closely the seeds we sprout in ourselves. Nothing can be hidden from God," unquote. But White had plenty hidden. Born in 1957, John Douglas White had spent time in the Navy and worked as a long-haul trucker before his life took a violent turn. His first known attack came in 1980 when he was just 22 years old, living in Battle Creek, Michigan, and married at the time. White invited a 17-year-old neighbor, Teresa Etherton, to his basement to see his stock car racetrack setup. So she would come over and they would go down there, and then without warning he would attack her, stabbing her 15 times and attempting to strangle her. As she lay there dying, White told her verbatim, "You're going to go now. I'm really sorry you had to go like this, but what the fuck? You're just a woman. A fucking monster." But luckily and miraculously, Atherton survived, hence why we got the verbatim quote. And White was luckily arrested and sent to prison, but unfortunately won an appeal on the grounds that his attorney hadn't raised an insanity defense. Incredibly, he was released in 1983 after serving just 2 years, with 2 years of probation and mandatory mental health treatment. One of the most terrifying things is that years later, Atherton was standing in line somewhere when she recognized a voice, turned around, and found White smiling at her. I feel so bad for this woman. Nothing happened, but just knowing that he is now free after serving only 2 years for trying to murder her was horrifying. Her attempted killer was free. White would go on living his life, and he would actually get remarried and would go on to have his own children. But his violence toward women continued. On July 11th, 1994, 26-year-old Vicky Sue Wall disappeared from Comstock Township, Michigan. Wall actually worked at the same textile company where White did maintenance work, and the two were having an affair despite White having the children and another baby on the way with his wife. Surveillance footage showed Wall getting into White's black pickup truck at 3 a.m., and this would be the last time anyone saw her alive. 6 weeks later, her badly decomposed body was found dumped in a rural area, not dressed except for a shirt and bra around her neck. White refused to cooperate with police or take a lie detector test, but luminol testing revealed blood evidence in his truck. With limited evidence, prosecutors offered a plea deal, and White pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter and received 8 to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, White made a chilling admission to a prison psychologist. He said that he had persistent violent fantasies about killing women and having relations with their corpses. Who the fuck is? Why? And just wait, cause this is making me mad. Knowing the psychologist knew that in all this. And then just wait, it's about to get a lot worse. Because this critical information somehow never made it to the parole board or to the communities where he would later live. He was released in 2007 after serving only 12 years for murdering someone. White would just migrate north to Isabella County, and that is where he found religion and reinvented himself as a pastor, the perfect front, leading the tiny Christ Community Fellowship Church in Mount Pleasant. He would live in a trailer and began dating Sally Gay, Rebecca's mother and a devoted member of his congregation. Sally had no idea about the full extent of White's past, and neither did her daughter Rebecca. By 2012, White was engaged to Sally and had become a fixture in Rebecca's life because he lived one street away, and he often babysat her son Conway. Obviously, he was going to become her stepfather. But all the while, those violent fantasies he confessed to the prison psychologist were still there, just waiting and simmering, and then hit a boiling point. He had inserted himself into the family's life in troubling ways. As he lived in the same trailer park just one street over from Rebecca, neighbors reported seeing him frequently cutting through yards to get to her home. He babysat Conway regularly while Rebecca worked. He was responsible for the Wednesday custody exchanges, dropping Conway off with his father, like he did when he found Conway on October 31st, 2012. It was an arrangement that showed how deeply Rebecca had trusted him. She trusted him with her own child. But having known that information, that all the prison systems, that the judicial systems just didn't think was relevant for the public to know, I can't imagine she would want to be within 6,000 feet of him. But most significantly, White couldn't explain his movements on the night of October 30th and the early morning of October 31st. The story just kind of kept changing. First he said that he hadn't seen Rebecca, and then he admitted he'd been a hurt railroader. The more investigators pressed, the more his composure started to crumble. So on November 1st, 2012, investigators, now having done their homework, knew about Teresa Atherton and about Vicky Sue Wall, John's previous victims. So they knew White had a pattern. During interrogation, detectives played on White's religious persona, telling him that Rebecca's body would deteriorate in the cold, weather, and that her family deserved to give her a proper Christian burial. They basically tried to appeal to whatever humanity might be left in him, which... But I don't think there is. He's a depraved, fucking sadistic monster. But okay, after intensive questioning, and just not being able to come up with any sort of alibi, John Douglas White broke down and confessed to the details of the murder. And they were horrifying. Based on White's confession, physical evidence, and the investigation, prosecutors pieced together the timeline of October 30th to 31st, 2012. This is the reconstruction of that night. Sometime in the late evening of October 30th, White sat in his trailer drinking beer and watching necrophilia pornography, just feeding his long-held fantasies about sex with dead women. But as we know, these weren't new desires, because he confessed them to the prison psychologist years earlier. But now he decided to act on them. In the early morning hours of Halloween, White walked the short distance to Rebecca's trailer. He knew she would be asleep at this point, and he knew Conway was there as well, most likely asleep. And he also knew that the door would likely be unlocked, cause this was a small community where neighbors just trusted each other, especially family. So White would enter easily and silently, and he would make his way to Rebecca's bedroom. And she was asleep, just like he suspected, with her Bible and devotional on the nightstand beside her, having read it before bed, completely unaware that a monster had entered her home. And that is when White would strike, and he would hit Rebecca with a rubber mallet, striking her head multiple times until she was unconscious. And these strikes were severe enough to incapacitate her, but not kill her at this point because White wanted her dead, but on his terms. And he then produced a zip tie, something he had brought with him, showing premeditation, and he would wrap it around her neck and pull tight. And that is how Rebecca Gay, at 24 years old, a single mother to Conway and daughter of Sally Gay, died in her own bed, and it would be from asphyxiation. And that is when White would do the unthinkable. And he would remove Rebecca's clothing and do what he was watching previously that I'm not going to talk about, because you can put that together on your own. But he would claim while confessing that he didn't remember exactly what happened, but it is heavily believed that he acted out on those fantasies. And when he was done, he wrapped her body in something from the trailer and dragged her out into the darkness. And he would dump her body in a ditch about a mile away behind some pine trees, leaving her exposed to the elements like she was nothing to him. And then, and this detail reveals the true depth of his depravity, White would return to Rebecca's trailer because Conway, her son, was still sleeping, completely unaware his mother had just been murdered in the next room and dumped a mile away. And White stayed in the trailer until morning and then got Conway up, dressed him in his Halloween costume as if it was a normal day, and drove him to the major parking lot in Midland to meet his father. And he handed over the child whose mother he had just murdered and acted like nothing had happened. So after getting the confession from John White, they would discover Rebecca's body in that shallow ditch behind a cluster of pine trees where John said she would be. And like I said before, it was approximately 1 mile from her mobile home, and he would leave her out there exposed to the cold October weather. The medical examiner would determine she had been beaten in the head multiple times with a blunt object and strangled, with a zip tie that was tightened around her neck until she was deceased. And all of her clothing had been removed except for a shirt, and she had been dead for over 24 hours by the time she was found. So Isabella County Prosecutor Larry Burdick initially charged White with first-degree murder, which could have resulted in life in prison without parole because the evidence was overwhelming. White's confession, the body location he provided, his history of violence against women, and the physical evidence at the scene. However, in March 2013, White agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors not seeking a life sentence. Just fucking scummy little asshole. And this plea agreement meant White would face 29 to 60 years in prison. And some of Rebecca's family members were frustrated by the deal, feeling White deserved the harshest possible punishment. But prosecutors explained it would spare the family, especially Sally Gay, from a lengthy trial and ensure White would likely die in prison given his age, cause he was 56 at this point. So during the plea hearing, White stood in his orange jumpsuit and admitted his guilt, and he would show no emotion as he recounted killing Rebecca. The courtroom was packed with Rebecca's family and friends, many wearing white t-shirts with her name printed on them. forced to listen to the man who destroyed their lives just casually describing his crimes. So on April 30th, 2013, John Douglas White faced sentencing before Judge Mark Doherty, and the judge had received numerous letters from people whose lives Rebecca had touched, all begging for the maximum sentence. And Sally Gay, Rebecca's mother and White's former fiancé, spoke for 20 minutes, and her pain was palpable as she addressed the man she had once planned to marry, the man she had trusted with her daughter and grandson, saying, quote, "Rebecca was always kind to you. She spent time with you, defended you," and then she would describe her daughter as the heart and soul of the family, someone who had been stolen from them by a man they welcomed into their lives. And Rebecca's sister Deborah also spoke, making an impassioned plea for the creation of a violent offender registry, saying, quote, "My sister might be alive if she had known about White's violent history," unquote. And she argued that just as communities are notified about sexual offenders, they should be warned about people with histories of violent crimes against women. Agreed. And Aaron Quinn, Rebecca's fiancé, submitted a statement about losing the woman he planned to marry. And Conway's father spoke about how his son would grow up without his mother now. And extended family members described the hole left in their lives with her gone. The prosecutor Larry Burdick argued for the maximum sentence, telling the judge, quote, "This defendant should never, ever, ever walk free in our society again," unquote. And White's attorney, James Paul, tried to argue for leniency, claiming White was remorseful and had been haunted by these fantasies rather than actively embracing them. What the fuck? How do these people? How are they? I mean, I know it's a job, but, like, how do you live with yourself anyway? But the argument obviously fell flat in a courtroom full of people whose lives had been shattered by White's actions. And when given the chance to speak, White offered only a brief statement saying, quote, "I'm sorry for my crime. That's all I have to say," unquote. No explanation, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, just pure evil. And Judge Doherty was visibly disgusted by the crime in White's history, and he would impose a sentence of 56 to 85 years in prison. And given White's age of 56 at this point, it was effectively a life sentence. And the judge made it clear that White should never be free again, stating that he was, quote, "a danger to society," unquote, and had shown a pattern of escalating violence against women throughout his entire life. So John Douglas White was sent to the Michigan Reformatory to begin serving his sentence. And prison officials classified him as a high-profile inmate given the nature of his crime and his status as a former pastor who had murdered a young mother, basically saying he would be a giant target in jail. But unfortunately, White wouldn't serve even 5 months of his sentence. And on August 28, 2013, at approximately 4:00 a.m., corrections officers conducting routine rounds found White having tied bed sheets together. Completely unsubscribed, if you know you know. I can't say that word, otherwise YouTube is going to take this video down basically. In prison, staff attempted to revive him, but it was too late. John Douglas White was pronounced dead at 56 years old, having taken the coward's way out rather than face decades in prison for his crimes. And for Rebecca's family, White's death brought mixed emotions. Some felt cheated that he had escaped earthly punishment, but others were relieved that they would never have to face him at parole hearings or worry about him potentially being released. And Sally Gay, when told of White's death, said she felt numb and that it didn't bring Rebecca back. But this case in particular highlights profound systemic failures in preventing repeat violent offenders from reoffending, caused despite White admitting to prison mental health professionals that he had violent fantasies about killing women and doing terrible things to them after the fact, and despite Michigan Departments of Corrections sending warnings to law enforcement agencies in 2007 labeling him dangerous, White was still able to become a pastor and gain the trust of a new family and commit another murder. But in the years since Rebecca's murder, her family has worked to create meaning from their tragedy. And Deborah Gay has been the most vocal advocate, pushing for legislation that would create a violent offender registry similar to sex offender registries. And their argument is simple but powerful. If Rebecca had known about White's history of violence against women, she might never have let him near her son or herself, and might never had trusted him at all, and might still be alive today. And Conway, who was just 3 when his mother was murdered, has been raised by his father with support from both sides of the family. And the family established a trust fund for Conway's education and future needs, ensuring that Rebecca's son would be provided for despite losing his devoted mother. And every Halloween is particularly difficult for the family, as what should be a day of childhood joy and community fun is forever tainted by the memory of October 31st, 2012. And Sally Gay has spoken out about how she can barely function on that day, just overwhelmed by memories of those 20 hours when Rebecca was missing in the horrible revelation that followed. And the family actually holds memorial services for Rebecca every year, gathering to remember the young woman who was the heart and soul of their family. And they share stories about her kindness, her devotion to Conway, her hard work, and her dreams for the future. And they keep her memory alive for Conway, ensuring he knows what an amazing mother he had even if he can't remember her clearly. And in 2022, on the 10th anniversary of Rebecca's death, the family actually organized a memorial run walk to raise money for domestic violence prevention and victim support services. And over 200 people participated, showing that even a decade later, Rebecca's story continues to touch people and inspire action. So this is not a story about John White, the disgusting, depraved monster. This is Rebecca's story, the story of a young woman who loved her son fiercely, who worked hard to build a better life, who believed in second chances and saw the good in people. And she was a daughter who made her parents proud, a sister who was the heart and soul of her family, a mother who read bedtime stories and said prayers every single night, a fiancé planning a future full of love, and an aunt who brought joy to 8 nieces and nephews who will grow up with only memories of her. Rebecca Gay deserved to watch her son grow up, and she deserved to marry Aaron Quinn. And she deserved to celebrate holidays with her family for decades to come. So let's choose to remember Rebecca Gay. She mattered, she was loved, and she should still be here. And that is it for today's video. I know it's shorter than normal. Let me know if you guys are okay with these types of episodes. Maybe I'll throw in little mini episodes here and there. Let me know what other cases you want me to dive into down below. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you have a very, very, very safe and fun Halloween. Until next time, I will see your beautiful face. Okay, stay safe out there. What if the one place you should feel safest became the stage for your worst nightmare? For most of us, that place is our home. Walls and locked doors mean protection. But what happens when those walls start to feel like a trap? The very air in your home turns heavy with fear. This is the story of Cindy James, a woman whose life would challenge everything we think we know about personal safety and security. Today we step into a story that blurs the line between reality and paranoia, victim and suspect, and protection and danger. And once you hear it, you may never look at your personal security the same way ever again. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too. You sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Yeah, that's right. I did a normal freak today. I didn't get freaky with it. Alright, Andrew P's here today, and Detective P, he's sleeping on the job as per usual. And also I apologize, I am still sick, so if I sound nasally, that is why. That is why I kind of sound sexy, don't worry though. Little bit, maybe. Maybe not, I don't know. But on a much more serious note today, we are talking about an absolutely horrifying story, one filled with paranoia, mystery, confusion, and tragedy. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this curious case together. Cindy James was born Cynthia Elizabeth Hack on June 12, 1944, in the small town of Oliver, British Columbia, during the final months of World War II. She was one of 6 children in a family of Russian-Canadian heritage and with 3 older brothers and 2 younger sisters. And her father, Otto Hack, was a disciplinarian, to say the least. He was an English teacher and a former Air Force colonel. And her mother, Matilda or Tilly Hack, was a homemaker. So post-war Canada in the late 1940s and 1950s was a time of rebuilding untraditional family values, and Cindy's upbringing reflected that era strictness. And in her private diaries years later, Cindy would recall that her childhood home was governed by firm rules and corporal punishment, leading her to feel an oppressive atmosphere while growing up. But despite the rigidity at home, those who knew young Cindy remember her as a warm and very sincere girl. And she had a gentle sense of humor and a caring nature that hinted at her future calling to help others. During her teenage years, the Hack family relocated for a time to Ottawa as Otto's military career took them across the country. British Columbia is better. Am I right? I'm holding my hand up, a high five, by the way. Sorry to Ottawa anyway. And Cindy attended high school in Ottawa, adapting to new environments and forming a compassionate outlook. And notable early experiences, such as growing up with 5 siblings and moving between communities, helped her shape a resilience and some empathy. So even as a teenager, Cindy showed an interest in helping people, which would soon guide her toward a career in healthcare. So at age 18, Cindy moved to the city of Vancouver, shout out to BC, to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse star. And in 1962, she enrolled in a nursing school program, embarking on the rigorous training required to join the profession. Shout out to nurses, my sister's one of them. God bless all of you. You guys are doing God's work out there. Anyway, Cindy proved to be a dedicated student. She was diligent in her studies and eager to gain practical experience. And she completed her nursing education in just a few years and earned her Bachelor of Science in Nursing by 1966. And that summer, at only 22 years old, Cindy graduated as a registered nurse, ready to devote herself to caring for others. She immediately started working as a pediatric nurse at the Vancouver General Hospital. So caring for children just came naturally to Cindy, and her colleagues later noted her competence and professionalism, especially when helping youth facing behavioral or emotional challenges. And over the next several years, she gained valuable experience in her field. And Cindy was passionate about her work and thrived in roles where she could protect and nurture vulnerable children. And it was during this period Cindy's personal life also saw major developments. Like in the summer of 1965, at just 21 years old, Cindy met Dr. Roy Mackpeace, who was an older South African-born psychiatrist. Now Roy was 18 years her senior. He was in his late 32nd, while Cindy was in her early 22nd. Yet the two formed a connection and married on December 9, 1966. Cindy's family was wary of this relationship from the start, and her parents felt the age gap and Roy's worldliness might spell trouble for naive young Cindy. But Cindy seemed hopeful about her marriage in the beginning, and she continued advancing her nursing career while adjusting to life as Mrs. Cindy Mackpeace. So by the late 1970s, Cindy had established herself as a well-respected professional in Vancouver's healthcare community. And in April of 1975, she accepted a position as a team coordinator at the Blenheim House, which was a Vancouver facility for children with behavioral disorders. And she would work there for 12 years, and she would become known for her steady leadership and empathy in dealing with these very difficult cases, because she often worked with children who were wards of the state or had behavioral issues requiring both firmness and kindness. Colleagues later praised her for being calm under pressure and truly committed to her patients' well-being. So by all appearances, Cindy was building the stable and caring life she had always wanted, a meaningful career, a home in the community, and relationships with friends and family who cared about her a lot. And financially and socially, Cindy was relatively secure. She continued to work full-time, balancing her professional responsibilities with her role as a very supportive spouse. Roy had taken a job as an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine after failing to get a Canadian medical license. Oh, but that's all right. He's making do. And their combined careers provided a comfortable living. And though they had no children of their own, Cindy poured her nurturing energy into the children at her workplace and stayed close with her siblings and parents. And it was during these years she formed lasting friendships, including with colleagues like Agnes Woodcock, who would later become one of her most loyal friends. From the outside, Cindy's life in the 1970s looked successful yet, rather ordinary. She was a dedicated nurse, a wife, a friend, and a very caring soul in her community. But Cindy's personal life, however, was not without its strains. Her marriage to Roy proved far from perfect. In fact, the significant age differences in temperament led to tensions behind closed doors. And according to Cindy's family on later investigations, the marriage was marred by emotional distance and occasional abuse. Cindy would later confide that Roy could be controlling and temperamental. And in one incident, she revealed to her family, Roy had thrown a heavy candy dish at her during an argument. What a piece of shit. And she also described disturbing conversations where Roy hypothetically spoke about murdering people with a crossbow, like you do. And Roy, for his part, denied any extreme violence, though he admitted to slapping Cindy on a couple of occasions in anger. That's really bad, Roy, and not cool. But such accounts painted a picture of a household that was increasingly unhappy and unsafe for Cindy as the years went by. And by the early 1982s, the cracks in Cindy's marriage had widened, and after 16 years together, Cindy and Roy separated in the summer of 1982. Cindy at this point was 38 years old and ready to start a new chapter on her own. And the couple's split was not amicable. There were lingering hard feelings and unresolved issues. But still, Cindy tried to maintain a polite relationship with her ex-husband. She even kept in occasional contact with Roy in the months following the separation, perhaps hoping to keep things civil, because she was a very just kind, empathetic person. But at the same time, Cindy leaned on her network of friends and family. And with her career and support network, Cindy was trying to move forward from her broken marriage, completely unaware that a far worse nightmare was about to begin. So in late September of 1982, Cindy told friends and family that she suspected someone was prowling around her house at night. And soon after, the truly frightening incidents started to begin. And on October 7th, Cindy received the first of many obscene phone calls. Sometimes the caller whispered threats like, "I'll get you one night, Cindy," while other times the phone would ring and deliver nothing but eerie silence and breathing on the other end. And obviously, Cindy was extremely alarmed, but she didn't recognize the voice, which seemed to change or disguise itself. And the content of the phone calls were often very erotic and violent in nature. So feeling threatened, Cindy reported these calls to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the SCAMP, the guys with the wicked brim hats that sit on horses for some reason because it's 2026, but they like living like it's 1883, baby 3, for some reason. So an officer visited her home and advised her to keep a log of the calls, and even suggested changing her number. And immediately after the officer left, Cindy received another call which allegedly said, "So you think calling the police will keep you safe? You wait, I've got my zipper open, I'm talking to my throbbing..." You know what? I'm not gonna continue that on, which is fucking horrifying. Oh my god. I like being at home alone. Just being a woman, I can't even imagine the terror she was feeling at this point. And luckily, she immediately hung up before the speaker could continue. But the harassment was only just the beginning. And within days, the situation escalated. And on October 15th, someone threw a rock through Cindy's back window and even entered her home, although nothing was stolen, which is even creepier to me. And a few days later, she found a pillow on her bed slashed open. So it seemed an unknown intruder was taunting her, breaking in without leaving clear evidence. To tenants that rented Cindy's basement reported hearing odd noises on the main floor after Cindy had left for work on October 20th. So Cindy at this point was absolutely terrified, and in response the SCAMP assigned a constable, Pat McBride, to investigate the early incident. And luckily, he took Cindy's claims seriously, and his protective instincts towards Cindy soon went beyond his official duty. Oh my! And they would develop a romantic relationship, and seeing how shaken she was, he offered to stay at her home temporarily to keep watch. How convenient for Pat. So on October 31st, 1982, Pat moved into Cindy's house, allegedly for 2 weeks of surveillance. And Cindy's estranged husband, Roy, quickly came under suspicion. hers. I mean, most likely, right. Most of the time you can bet your bottom dollar it's the husband or it's the wife. It's the spouse. So obviously, he was the prime suspect in all of this time. McBride initially believed Roy might be behind the harassment given the bitter separation. Remember, it didn't end amicably, and he had a history of being a jackass. And Cindy herself sent mixed signals about Roy, telling police she didn't think Roy would do such a thing, but confiding to friends that he had been violent before. It's almost like she was trying to protect him or give him the benefit of the doubt. But one night, not long after McBride had moved in, he caught Roy lurking in his car in the alley behind Cindy's house. He confronted Roy, and Roy claimed he was just trying to catch the intruder in the act, then hurriedly drove off after Pat informed Roy of their relationship. In a strange twist, Pat later would even discuss the case with Roy when Cindy would invite him over in an attempt to keep their relationship in a positive place. So both men, warily united by a desire to catch whoever was terrorizing her. It was like a weird, enemies to not quite lovers, but buddies in trying to catch Cindy's stalker. But despite these efforts, the frightening events would continue, and neighbors would report seeing a strange man outside Cindy's home on multiple occasions, and a man they swore was not Roy Makepeace. So at this point, all signs were pointing to an unknown stalker with a cruel intent. So through late 1980 and into 1983, the harassment against Cindy escalated steadily in both frequency and violence. So before moving out on December 1st, Pat also experienced a strange phone call at the home while Cindy was there as well. And the caller spoke no words, similar to calls that Cindy had reported earlier. And he also discovered that the phone line outside her house had been cut in 5 different places in late November. And also, disturbing notes began appearing. First, there was a note pinned to the windshield of her car with a picture of a dead body placed under a medical sheet at the end of November. And then during Christmas week, Cindy found a chilling message pinned to her car's windshield, and it was a picture of a woman with her throat slashed with the words "Merry Christmas Time." And this was an extremely grim warning just as the holidays approached. It's like an actual horror story in real life unfolding. But the implication was clear. Someone wanted to scare Cindy to death. And on January 27th, unfortunately, the situation turned violent. Cindy's friend and co-worker Agnes would cock-drop by Cindy's home that night and found a scene out of a nightmare, because Cindy was lying unconscious in her backyard with a nylon stocking knotted tightly around her neck. And Agnes revived her friend, who woke up dazed, freezing, and terrified. Cindy told Agnes that she had gone out to the garage to get a box when a man grabbed her from behind. And she claimed the attacker dragged her into the garage where another man was waiting, and together they strangled her until she was passed out. And before losing consciousness, Cindy said the men threatened to kill her younger sister if she went to the police star. She also alleged that a knife had been used to her during this attack. So later she was examined by doctors, but the physical evidence did not match the brutality of her story, and they found no definitive injuries of on Cindy's body. And some investigators began to quietly question whether Cindy was telling them the whole truth. A detective, David Boyer Smith, remained uncertain, and he felt Cindy might be holding back details out of fear, noting she seemed in fear of herself and her family, and perhaps afraid the attackers would retaliate if she spoke freely. Nonetheless, the police continued their efforts to protect Cindy, and they urged her to see a psychiatrist to cope with the trauma. But Cindy refused, worried that being labeled crazy would only undermine her credibility. So instead, she agreed to visit a general counselor for support. And as the onslaught of harassment continued, Cindy took drastic steps, and in early 1983, she moved out of her house hoping a new address would throw off her stalker. But it didn't. And she moved to a new place in West Vancouver on February 1st, where she was greeted with a letter less than a week later threatening her, saying, "Run, rabbit, run. I'll show you how fucking good I am soon. Bang, bang, you're dead," quoting several songs, which is so fucking weird. Like Red Rabbit, Run, and then the other one is Bang Bang, which I believe is from Kill Bill Bill. But it all together, absolutely horrifying. Like, I don't even know what I'd do. And I go to the police, I guess, but I would just be constantly on the run. But I don't even know how someone could live with this going on. It's horrifying. So even after relocating a second time in quick succession, the second move happening in April, the threatening calls and letters followed her. And Roy, as part of an attempt to reconcile, along with several other gifts, paid Cindy's airfare to visit her brother Roger in Indonesia during the summer. And upon her return home, she received yet another threatening letter on August 22nd, and this time it read, "Welcome back, death, blood, hate, etc." What? So whoever was tormenting Cindy always seemed to find out where she lived. So, desperate for security, Cindy repainted her car to make it less recognizable. And she also hired a professional private investigator, Ozzy Cabin, to watch her and dig into this mystery. So Cabin equipped Cindy with a two-way emergency radio and also noticed that she went above and beyond to protect herself, including such measures as keeping a personal panic button and carrying pepper spray at all times. She was determined to stay alive. But despite her precautions, the stalker was undeterred. In late 1983, horrifying new incidents sent waves of panic through Cindy's life, and numerous calls continued to be placed to both her home residence and at work, where even some of her co-workers reported answering the calls only to hear no one at the other end. And she discovered the bodies of 3 strangled cats in her yard, and each cat had been cruelly tied with a rope, echoing the ligatures used on Cindy. The sight devastated Cindy. It was a twisted message that even innocent creatures around her weren't safe, and she confided in a private diary that she suspected her ex-husband Roy was behind this particular act. And she noted that gardening was one of her beloved hobbies and something that Roy had resented during their marriage. So she wondered if Roy dumped the dead cats to destroy her garden as a form of revenge. So police did question Roy repeatedly in this period, especially after the upcoming incident in early 1984, but he staunchly denied any involvement and pointed fingers elsewhere. So as 1984 began, the violence against Cindy appeared to reach terrifying new levels. And on January 30th, private investigator Ozzy Cabin heard strange sounds crackling over the two-way radio he had given Cindy. Unable to reach her, Cabin raced to Cindy's house, and he arrived to find all the doors locked. So he forced his way in, and there on the living room floor was Cindy's unconscious body, and a paring knife had been stabbed through her hand, pinning a note to her skin in the carpet. And the note, made from cut-and-paste letters, bore a horrifying message saying, quote, "Now you must die, cunt," unquote. Just, I can't stop saying horrifying, but it's literally written like a horror author. So obviously Cindy was rushed to the hospital, and when she awoke, she recounted to Cabin what little she remembered. And she had seen a man coming through her front door gate just before being struck on the head with a blunt object. And she vaguely recalled being held down and a needle pricking her arm before everything went black. And indeed, doctors found a fresh needle mark on Cindy's arm, but to their surprise, there were no drugs detected in her system. And she allegedly took a polygraph after the incident and showed no deception, though the conducting officer later stated the results were inconclusive. To the constable who reported to Cindy's home that evening, he also noted that it appeared someone had tried to smudge the evidence, as some of the blood on the floor was smeared in a circular motion. So these baffling details just kind of deepen the mystery. But the summer of 1984 would be seen as the height of intensity for Cindy. So on June 18th, Cabin hurried to her place after she called him panicked, only to find her dog Heidi physically abused and tied up with what appeared to be the same type of rope used on the cats from before. And she was in the basement alongside a note that included the words "Happy Birthday" and erotic, explicit photos. And Cindy was found shuddering in her garden. Cabin noted that there was a cigarette but on the windowsill of the basement that didn't match the usual brand that Cindy smoked. And more calls would be placed to the house over the next several weeks, one of which Cabin answered, and then a dead cat was found in the stairwell, and another in which the caller said, "You're dead, bitch. It's gonna feel good," unquote. And yet another placed to one of Cindy's co-workers which said, "Get rid of the big pig." And Cindy told Cabin that there were 2 men impersonating officers that showed up to her doorstep on July 1st, but they left when she radioed him. And Tilly, Cindy's mother, spent the night with her on July 9th, and at some point late during the night, Heidi began barking, awaking Tilly, who found Cindy examining the windows and doors on the main floor. Shortly afterwards, they heard the doorbell ring, and a window was cracked in multiple places. So again, just all these terrifying things happening constantly. Cindy could not get a moment of peace or any sort of peace of mind. There was always somebody that seemed to be watching and terrorizing her. And just 2 weeks later, Cindy was attacked again in a nearby park while walking her dog on July 23rd. And she described the attackers as a bearded man driving a green van that had a female passenger. And Cindy was found several hours later with a nylon stocking around her neck as she attempted to enter the home of a neighbor in an altered state. Cabin found her dog wandering in the park, and she would be taken to the hospital again to be treated. And doctors found puncture wounds in her right arm this time. And there was also a receptionist at the hospital that reported an odd call while Cindy was there because the front desk received a call from a man with an accent asking about security. Police later played audio of Roy's voice for the receptionist, who claimed there was a strong possibility they could have been the same person. Following this attack, there continued to be calls placed to Cindy's residence on similar oddities, but no notable incidents outside of the hypnotrophia breakthrough and psych ward commitments. No notable incidents until early July of 1985 when a package arrived at her place with more nylon stockings and another note saying blood flowing freely. And on July 27th, she discovered rotting raw meat in a container near her front door. And that's when the alleged stalker would attempt a new strategy, and that was Cindy reported a fire in her home on August 5th to the police, and when they examined the area, they discovered what looked like burnt newspaper thrown about the room. And another fire was reported the day after, and yet another on August 21st. So when authorities arrived at the scene, a heated discussion was occurring between Cindy and Cabin, as she explained that she discovered the house on fire when she returned from walking her dog, and the bathroom window was found partially opened, but no evidence that anyone had been through it, and more burnt newspaper remains were found as well at World. And it was later said by one of the detectives that they believe Cindy started the fire herself. Cindy once again moved to a new residence in Richmond on December 1st, but there seemed to be no end to where she would be followed, because just 10 days later, she was found dazed in a ditch a little over 3.5 miles from her home on December 11th. And she had men's work boots and a single glove on, and you guessed it, she had a nylon stocking tied around her neck just like before. And she had hypothermia and was taken to the hospital, where they believed she had been injected with a tranquilizer this time. And she also had various cuts and bruises found on her body. And Cindy appeared to possess no memory of what had occurred. So as the wave of incidents appeared never-ending, Cindy attempted anonymity in the beginning of 1986. And she would actually change her last name from Macpeace to James in hopes that that would help hide her identity. And on April 16th, Agnes and Tom Woodcock stayed over only to be awoken in the middle of the night by Cindy, who allegedly heard something going on downstairs. And when they went to check, a fourth fire was burning in the basement. And the house phone was also dead, which they discovered as they attempted to call the fire department. So Tom ran to the neighbor's house to make the call, and as he returned to Cindy's, he claimed to see a man standing on the street nearby. But the man took off as Tom approached him. So Cindy, being terrified, went to stay with the Woodcocks for a little while afterwards. So it was clear that her mental health was deteriorating greatly. So naturally, Cindy's case had become one of the most puzzling investigations the scamp had ever encountered, because the sheer number of incidents, dozens upon dozens of calls, letters, break-ins, and assaults had everyone grasping for a clear pattern, nor any suspect. So investigators redoubled their efforts, and police surveillance was stepped up, and at times up to 14 officers watched Cindy's house around the clock in hopes of catching the perpetrator in the act. But oddly, these stakeouts yielded nothing. No attacks or strange occurrences ever happened while police were actively watching Cindy's home. Yet, almost as soon as surveillance stopped, the harassment would start up again. So this eerie timing made some officers begin to suspect that Cindy herself might be orchestrating at least part of the drama. and skeptics wondered if a stalker knew when the police were present. Could it be that Cindy was somehow tipping someone off or even faking incidents when nobody was looking? It seems awful to even think about, like a victim making themselves a victim, but officers needed to, look at every single angle, every single possibility. Cindy's parents, however, dismissed this as just coincidence, arguing that any real stalker would obviously lie low when the police were nearby, which, I agree. If there is a stalker, they would obviously see the police are around and not want to intervene in any way as to not get caught. And Cindy's own behavior during the investigation raised further questions, though, because according to both police and private investigator Cabin, Cindy was frustratingly evasive at times, and she didn't always tell authorities everything she knew or everything she suspected. For example, she initially withheld her growing belief that Roy was behind the harassment, only confiding that to a few people while telling police she wasn't sure. And Cabin observed that Cindy often seemed unlike a quote-unquote normal victim, sometimes acting as if she was hiding something. Cindy's mother, Tilly, later explained that Cindy had been explicitly threatened by her attackers, a knife held to Cindy's throat with the warning that if she talked, her family would be the next targets. So this threat might explain why Cindy appeared to hold back details when speaking to investigators. But still, the lack of full cooperation made the police increasingly suspicious. And some members of the scamp openly considered the possibility that Cindy was staging the incidents due to mental health issues or some unknown motive. And meanwhile, genuine leads were scarce. As noted earlier, though police questioned Roy Makepeace many times, they never found concrete evidence linking him to any sort of crime. And Roy vehemently denied harassing Cindy and even wrote a 6-page letter to her father, Otto, insisting that shadowy criminal figures like mafia or drug dealers must be behind Cindy's torment. And he also pushed this narrative to the police as well. Investigators briefly eyed other potential suspects, such as acquaintances or former patients from Cindy's work, but nothing panned out. To dive even deeper, the scamp took the extraordinary step of having Cindy undergo multiple hypnosis sessions in late 1984 and early 1985. And under hypnosis, Cindy made a shocking claim. She quote-unquote remembered witnessing Roy murder a young couple and dismember their bodies years earlier at a remote cabin. What? Roy, what? We knew you were a piece of shit, but if this is true, my lord, lock him up. Lock him up anyway, though you can't throw fucking ashtrays at people either. But this sensational allegation prompted a full investigation into Roy, but it quickly fell apart. And Cindy's own sister had been on the supposed trip to the cabin and recalled nothing of the sort, and no evidence of any such murders was ever found. And the consensus was that Cindy's hypnosis-induced memory was either false or a product of her mounting stress and trauma. So Roy is clear for now. All right. But not long after this, in July of 1985, Cindy attempted to unsubscribe, if you know what I mean. A drug overdose and was involuntarily committed to the psych unit at Lionsgate Hospital in Vancouver. And she later stated it wasn't a genuine attempt to die, but rather an act of utter desperation for the nightmare to end. So coming out of the hospital, Cindy was at her lowest point because the police were outing her and the attacks continued unabated, and she just felt utterly alone. So while staying with the Woodcocks after the fires at her home, Cindy was suffering from severe depression and anorexia, and she had lost weight and often refused to eat, and she would make comments that she felt her life was no longer worth living. Sensing her fragile mental state, Cindy's longtime psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Connolly, had her involuntarily committed for 2 weeks at the psychiatric ward at St. Paul's Hospital in early 1986 for her own safety. And she then had a comprehensive psychological examination conducted on her at Riverview Hospital, where she was transferred after her stay at St. Paul's. And the report noted that she was initially extremely resistant, but then began to open up. And she maintained good eye contact unless discussing traumatizing incidents, during which she would hide her eyes, speak slowly, and often break down in tears. During these moments, she would also regularly ask if her responses showed that she was crazy or not. And as we know, her IQ was very high, well above average, The type of individual that matches her personality could be negative with unpredictable mood swings, as they tend to anticipate negative outcomes and perpetuate them through their behavior. Quote, "This type of person ends to be vulnerable to fears," unquote, Dr. Connolly noted. And they would go on to say she knew she was doubted, and that was what slowly drove her crazy, unquote. After 10 weeks of intensive treatment, Cindy's condition stabilized enough for her to be released. It was then that she made a chilling confession to her father, and Cindy said that she knew more about the attacks than she had been saying. In fact, she claimed to know who was behind them. However, she refused to name the person or persons, cryptically telling her family she would solve the case herself if the police couldn't. So if Cindy truly knew Hurt or Menner's identity, why wouldn't she speak out about it? Was she protecting someone, or was she just so terrified by the threats that she'd rather face danger alone than put loved ones at risk? So those questions loomed large as the saga crept toward its climax. So as the years dragged on with no arrest or definitive proof of an assailant, theories about Cindy James's situation diverged sharply, and one theory, favored by Cindy's family and some friends, was that Cindy was indeed the victim of an extremely cunning stalker who managed to terrorize her while evading police capture, possibly her ex-husband Troy, or another person with a deep grudge. And supporters of this theory pointed to the genuinely unexplained evidence, such as the witness sightings of a strange man lurking near Cindy's home, and the violent attacks that would be hard to self-inflict, like the knife through her hand, and the fact that Cindy seemed truly afraid for her life. And notably, Cindy's private investigator Ozzie Cabin had encountered physical evidence that suggested a real-life intruder. One such piece of evidence was the incident in June 1980 where Cabin found Cindy's normally gentle dog, Heidi, tied up, and the cigarette butt in the house that did not match Cindy's brand, indicating someone else had been there potentially. Cabin argued Cindy could never harm her own pet and believed this was proof of an outside perpetrator, and he also personally experienced some of the odd phone calls himself. So those convinced of the stalker theory felt the police simply hadn't caught the person yet, and perhaps due to underestimating Cindy's claims or biases that made them stop looking for a culprit too soon. But on the other side, many in law enforcement came to embrace a very different explanation, and that was that Cindy was manufacturing the entire ordeal due to psychological issues. The scamp publicly acknowledged spending over $1 million in countless hours investigating Cindy's complaints with little to no concrete evidence to show for it. And not a single independent witness ever saw an attacker, only the aftermath, and fingerprints or DNA from a suspect weren't ever found. And crucially, none of the over 100 reported incidents occurred during extensive police surveillance. These facts led the scamp to suspect that Cindy might be either hoaxing the events or harming herself in some form of attention-seeking or mental distress. And Dr. Anthony Marcus, a psychologist, was brought into this case and theorized that Cindy could have been suffering from dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personalities, and can experience amnesia between them, or a similar condition that caused her to harm herself without full awareness of. And he famously remarked, quote, "This woman was under siege from whatever source, inside or out," unquote, capturing the uncertainty of whether the threat came from an external stalker or from Cindy's own mind. And other psychiatric experts who evaluated Cindy had varying diagnoses. Some felt she had a hysterical or borderline personality disorder stemming from trauma, which might lead her to fabricate or exaggerate incidents. And significantly, the police also uncovered instances that cast doubt on Cindy's claims, in one example being a phone call in which tracing technology showed Cindy's own phone had dialed her number, suggesting a staged, quote-unquote, harassing call. And between these two extremes, a victim of an unknown assailant versus a troubled hoaxer lay more nuanced theories. Some who studied the case wondered if Cindy might have been both mentally ill and genuinely targeted. Like Dr. Conley believed Cindy truly was harassed, but also suffered mental health issues due to prolonged trauma. So it was possible, they thought, that an initial campaign of abuse, perhaps by an ex or someone with a grudge, had caused Cindy such psychological damage that she later imagined, or even fabricated additional incidents, unable to distinguish reality from her own nightmares. Another theory floated was that Cindy had an accomplice, someone who helped her stage scenes like the hog tying in injections, which could explain how she pulled off the more physically complicated stunts. However, no evidence of any co-conspirator ever surfaced. Roy, despite intense scrutiny, was never charged, so the lack of clear motive for anyone else, because Cindy had no known enemies outside of her marriage, further muddled the entire picture. And the investigation was at a stalemate, with Scamp largely convinced there was no stalker, while Cindy and her supporters insisted a very real danger lurked in the shadows. So throughout the 1980 seconds, Cindy's bizarre case did not stay private, and instead, it gradually drew public attention, especially in the Vancouver area. Neighbors in Cindy's Richmond community were aware something was terribly wrong because they saw police cars at her house, frequently unheard rumors of the unheard rumors, frightening incidents. And some neighbors were very sympathetic, worried that a violent stalker might be prowling the neighborhood. But others grew skeptical or fearful, wondering if Cindy was crying wolf or if danger truly stalked their streets. So this divided opinion in the community mirrored the divide within the investigation itself. And by the time of the most dramatic incident, local newspapers had begun reporting on the mystery of Cindy James. And some early coverage highlighted the strangeness of the attacks and the idea of a possible stalker who couldn't be caught. But as police skepticism became known, tabloids and talk shows latched on to the more sensational angle that Cindy might be delusional or faking it. Classic media unpublic reaction to Cindy's story was intense. Many felt deep sympathy for her, viewing Cindy as a woman failed by those who should have protected her, and they heavily criticized the scamp for dismissing her pleas and noted how in that era, stalking was not well understood or always taken seriously by authorities. But others, however, pointed to the lack of evidence and the strange contradictions, suspecting mental illness or a hoax. And letters to newspaper editors, and early online forums, and later discussions on podcasts and even Reddit reveal that even decades later, people remain strongly divided on Cindy James. The only consensus overall was that the case was both frightening and frustrating, leaving everyone with more questions than answers. So by 1988, the pressure on everyone involved in Cindy's case had reached a breaking point. And Cindy herself was trying to rebuild some normality, and she actually got a job as a nurse at Richmond General Hospital in August of 1987. And soon the harassment resumed with familiar patterns: smashed windows, porch lights unscrewed, and attempts to break in reported to police. And Cindy was utterly exhausted by years of fear, and she started taking even more precautions. She invited friends to stay over more frequently so she wouldn't be alone. Her friends Agnes and Tom would often spend the night to help Cindy feel safer, and even renting out part of her house was a safety tactic. In early 1989, Cindy let a trusted acquaintance, Richard Johnston, a life insurance agent that she purchased a policy from, move into her basement suite. And for the scamp, the case had become a sore spot because they had devoted an enormous amount of resources, and their official stance was that Cindy likely wasn't in danger from anyone but herself. And internally, some officers felt vindicated in this conclusion, but others were still uneasy. At least one detective, Jerry Anderson, treated Cindy with patience and continued to investigate leads, earning Cindy's gratitude for taking her seriously. And Cindy even filed a formal complaint against the scamp for how dismissively some officers treated her, pointing out that only Detective Anderson had shown her consistent respect and diligence. And this complaint indicates the level of strain between Cindy and the police by 1989 because trust had eroded on both sides. Meanwhile, the unknown events persisted, keeping everyone on edge, but mostly Cindy. And in October of 1988, Roy received frightening, anonymous voice messages about Cindy on his answering machine containing phrases like, and quote, "more smack, more downers, another grand after we waste the cunt." And he turned those tapes over to a lawyer, suspecting police might use them to implicate him, but also perhaps to document that something odd was still going on. Shortly after, in late 1988 or early 1989, Cindy was found unconscious and half-naked, this time in her own garage, hog-tied yet again with nylon stockings. And the scamp hired not expert Trobert. He then and analyzed the bindings at the time and concluded it was, quote-unquote, highly unlikely Cindy could have tied herself up in that elaborate manner, especially given her physical condition. And this should have been a powerful clue pointing to foul play, yet skepticism lingered. And on April 8th, a note was found at Richmond General Hospital, her workplace, put together with cut and pasted letters spelling out, quote-unquote, "So Cindy. Row. Just. And other attempted break-ins around this period produced mixed evidence because one time police dogs detected no intruder scent, and another time dogs did pick up a trail leading from Cindy's house over a fence, suggesting someone had fled. And these conflicting outcomes kept the truth just out of reach. And with each new report, tensions mounted, and Cindy's friends and family feared that sooner or later something truly awful would happen if the mystery wasn't solved. Cindy herself was described as jumpy and just worn down, but also determined to get to the bottom of it one way or another. So in May of 1989, nearly 7 years after the nightmare began, it all came to a head, and the stage was set for a final tragic turn of events. So on May 25th, 1989, Cindy vanished under circumstances that sent chills through those who knew her. That day had started normally enough. Cindy went to Richmond General Hospital, where she worked, to pick up her paycheck around 4:00 p.m. And a co-worker who chatted with her recalled Cindy seemed to be in good spirits, even mentioning that there had been no harassment incidents for a couple of weeks, a rare bit of relief in a very troubled life. And Cindy then ran errands in the evening, and surveillance cameras and witnesses later confirmed she stopped at a Safeway grocery store and visited a Bank of Montreal ATM at the Blundell Shopping Center, depositing her paycheck just before 8:00 p.m. And she had plans that night to have friends over, and those friends were Agnes and Tom Woodcock, and they were scheduled to come by Cindy's house to play bridge and stay overnight for her safety. And she also had scheduled the installation of an expensive infrared security system at her home. But Cindy never showed up for the appointment or to greet her friends. And when the Woodcocks arrived at Cindy's home around 10:00 p.m. to check on her, they found the house dark and locked, and Cindy's car was still gone. This immediately struck them as unusual and very worrying. So the Woodcocks spoke with Johnston, the man renting her basement, who said Cindy mentioned she was out shopping earlier and should be back soon. But growing alarmed, Agnes and Tom began arriving to search for her. Before long, they discovered Cindy's car, a silver Chevrolet, abandoned in the parking lot of the nearby shopping mall, the same Blundell Center where she had been seen earlier. And inside the car were groceries and a wrapped gift, presumably something that Cindy had bought for a friend's child's upcoming birthday. And on the ground beneath the car, they spotted items from Cindy's wallets scattered about, as if someone had dumped them out. And even more ominous, blood was found on the driver's side door of the car. So realizing something was terribly wrong, the Woodcocks went straight to the scamp to report Cindy missing, even though only a few hours had passed since anyone had last seen her. And given Cindy's extensive history with the police, the response was swift, and officers arrived at the scene and carefully examined the car. And the presence of blood in Cindy's belongings obviously indicated possible foul play. And that night, police also entered Cindy's house to look for clues or signs of a struggle. And inside, everything was eerily normal. The home was neat and nothing disturbed, with all Cindy's beloved houseplants well watered and in order. It was as if she had simply stepped out and just never returned. So authorities launched an intensive search, and the Canadian Coast Guard scoured local rivers and the coastline, because Richmond is crisscrossed by waterways, in case Cindy had been dumped or fallen into the water. The days went by with no sign of Cindy, though a strange twist emerged when Johnston, her tenant-in-life insurance agent, reported a suspicious phone call to the police. Johnston said that several days after Cindy disappeared, someone phoned his office claiming to be Cindy's father, Otto, and inquiring about Cindy's life insurance policy. And the secretary who took the call found it odd and insisted the father would need to come in person to discuss any policy details. When asked, the real auto hack denied making any such call. So this suggested that an unknown individual was already thinking about Cindy's life insurance payout, and that's a detail that implied someone was expecting to benefit or cover their tracks. However, this lead never solidly panned out into identifying a suspect. And for 2 excruciating weeks, Cindy's friends and family waited on hope for her safe return or at least some clue to her fate. In the case of the missing nurse made headlines, and the whole community just braced itself. And unfortunately, the outcome would be the worst anyone feared. Because on the morning of June 8, 1989, a municipal road worker named Gordon Starchiukari was doing his rounds in an area of Richmond not far from where Cindy's car had been found. And in the backyard of an old abandoned house on Blundell Road, Starchiukari noticed something alarming, and that was a body lying in the brush, and it was the body of a woman, and it didn't appear to be recent. And he immediately alerted authorities, and police arrived, and the scene that unfolded was as grim as it was perplexing, as the deceased woman was identified as Cindy James, who had now been missing for about 2 weeks. She was found on her side in the overgrown yard, and the condition of her body told a horrifying story, because Cindy's hands and feet were tied tightly behind her back in a cruel hog tie with a black stocking, similar to all those other times she had been attacked, and it was also wound tightly around her neck, and it looked unmistakably like a murder scene. Yet the location was oddly public. This abandoned house sat along a busy street with plenty of foot traffic and passersby. So had Cindy's body been here the whole 2 weeks in an area people frequently walked by? It seemed hard to believe no one noticed earlier. So investigators examining the area found an extra chilling detail on the exterior fuel tank of the house. Someone had spray painted a crude graffiti message in orange paint that read, quote unquote, "Some bitch died here." Absolutely horrible. And a line of the same spray paint ran across the ground, literally circling the spot where Cindy's body lay. And inside the abandoned building, the word, quote unquote, devil was found spray painted, though it wasn't clear if it was related or left by vandals at another time. But the macabre spray painted message in the way Cindy's body was positioned suggested the perpetrator, if there was one, wanted the discovery to feel like a taunt. And forensic experts and pathologist Dr. Sheila Carlisle carefully documented the state of Cindy's remains. Cindy's body had begun decomposing, consistent with being exposed outdoors for days. And forensic entomologist or bug expert Gail Anderson later analyzed insect activity and concluded that Cindy likely died around June 2nd, 1989, meaning her body had been out there for roughly a week before being found. And the bindings were so tight that one of Cindy's fingers had been cut down to the bone by her own fingernail in the struggle. And they also found what looked like a needle puncture mark on the inside of her right elbow, evidence that matched Cindy's prior reports of being injected during attacks. But where was the needle, or any other evidence besides the body, for that matter? So the autopsy results added another layer of mystery. A coroner determined that Cindy did not die from strangulation or external injuries at the scene, and instead she had succumbed to a massive overdose of drugs, specifically a combination of morphine, diazepam or Valium, and furosemide, which is a sleep aid. Toxicology tests showed an extraordinary amount of morphine, about 10 times a lethal dose in her bloodstream. And Cindy's stomach contained traces of the drugs, suggesting she had swallowed pills, another lethal dose aside from the morphine. But experts couldn't determine for sure how the morphine entered her system. It might have been taken orally or injected. It was baffling, as one pharmacologist put it. And what they did conclude is that such a huge overdose would have incapacitated Cindy very quickly, likely knocking her unconscious within minutes and killing her within a few hours, especially if administered by injection. And this raised questions as if Cindy was murdered. How did the killer manage to tie her up after dosing her up after dosing her? Or alternatively, if Cindy somehow took the drugs herself, how on earth could she tie herself up in that condition? And the scamp, upon these findings, leaned towards a controversial conclusion. Because despite the bizarre position of Cindy's bound body, police theorized that Cindy's death might have been an accident resulting from her own actions or an unsuspicion, if you know what I mean. And in their view, all the prior incidents had been staged, and this final scene was the culmination of Cindy's troubled plan and perhaps an unsuspicion made to look like a murder. And this perspective was quickly reported in some press outlets, casting doubts on Cindy even in death. However, not everyone agreed with the police's take, and Cindy's family was adamant that she would never have done that to herself, especially not in such a horrific fashion. And her father, Otto, publicly stated, quote, "There is no way that she could have been able, after ingesting that amount of drugs, to tie herself up," unquote. And he pointed out that no syringe or drinking straw, which could have been used to consume the morphine, was found at the scene, implying that a third party had to be involved. And Ozzy Cabins, Cindy's private investigator, personally went to view Cindy's body at the morgue on June 10th, 1989. And there he made a crucial observation, because the post-mortem blood pooling on Cindy's skin was on the opposite side of her body than how she was found. In other words, the blood had settled on her left side, but she was discovered lying on her right side. So to Cabin, this suggested Cindy eyed elsewhere and was moved to the abandoned house yard after death. And if true, that directly contradicts the idea of unsuspicion in that spot. But despite these troubling discrepancies, the authorities were not convinced it was murder either. And they undertook one final, exhaustive step to try to resolve the manner of Cindy's death, and that was a full coroner's inquest. So as the inquest unfolded, two competing theories about Cindy's death solidified, each with its own set of supporting evidence and passionate advocates. The first one is unsuspicion, if you know what I mean. So it posits that Cindy, driven by a combination of mental illness and desire for attention or sympathy, orchestrated the harassment incidents and ultimately unsubscribed. Supporters of this view lean on the lack of concrete evidence of any other person involved. After 7 years of intense investigation, not one suspect was identified, no fingerprints or DNA of a perpetrator turned up, and no one ever saw an attacker besides Cindy herself. And they pointed out that when Cindy was under close surveillance, nothing ever happened, implying she could only act out when she knew she wasn't being watched, because this seemed to be suspicious timing to a lot of people. And at the inquest, it was revealed that Cindy's sister found a glass cutter in Cindy's purse after her death, along with the syringe kitten Celine. The existence of these things in her possession, along with the medication she hoarded, suggest a level of planning. And thanks to not experts see his and all's demonstration, we know that the hard die could be self-inflicted in about 3 minutes, which showed that the final scene was at least feasible in Cindy's mental state. And as the central factor for this theory, the stress of believing that no one believed her, and her divorce, and potentially untreated trauma from childhood, and the attention she got as a victim could have created a cycle she just couldn't escape. And investigators noted that Cindy's stories changed. Sometimes she said one attacker, and sometimes she said there was 2 or 3 attackers. Her details would shift, which is consistent with a fabricated narrative that evolves. And even Cindy's own words hinted at internal conflict, as she told a psychiatrist that people doubting her was driving her crazy. And this was an acknowledgement that the disbelief was tormenting her. And the final scene had no apparent signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. And another angle is that it might not have been an intentional unsuspicion. Cindy could have planned to drug herself just enough to set the scene and then dramatically be rescued, but accidentally overdosed in the process of staging, resulting in an unplanned death. And perhaps Cindy intended to make it appear as if her or mentor had finally killed her, hoping her death would be seen as murder, hence tying herself to ensure it looked violent, but miscalculated how powerful the drugs were, which to me is hard to believe since she is a nurse. That's part of her education. If anybody would be able to, just not quite die, but she would be able to know that information. So the idea of it being accidental, I don't think adds up personally. And the biggest thing for me is the blood pooling, because bodies that sit somewhere for a long time, the blood pools, and if you were to be flipped, it doesn't change. So somebody would have had to have flipped her. Is it possible that somebody came along and bypassed her, that flipped her and then just didn't report it? I guess, but it's just... I don't know, it feels unlikely. And there are more holes in this theory, because it's tough to imagine someone enduring horrific self-harm for years, including stabbing herself through the hand, strangling yourself to unconsciousness, lying in a ditch while hypothermic without any slip-up or confession. And if Cindy did all that herself, it would make her one of the most extraordinary hoaxers in history, and physically and mentally capable of extreme pain and high risk. And also, why would Cindy continue to stage incidents even after being in a psych ward or after nearly dying? If it was attention she wanted, she already had it many times over. And if it was to frame Roy, the police had thoroughly investigated him, and the motive for self-torment becomes murky at that point. And in the end, intentionally or not, Cindy became a victim of her own dangerous game in the unsexpression or accidental unsexpression theory. And then, of course, there is the murder theory. And in this scenario, Cindy James was murdered by a person or persons who had been harassing her all along. And advocates of this theory argue that physical evidence of binding and injection at the death scene is nearly impossible to reconcile with unsexpression. Cause how could Cindy hog-tie herself so expertly under heavy sedation and then hide the needle or any apparatus used to ingest morphine, all before losing consciousness? That's a big one too. There was nothing found at the scene, so if it was herself, it just wouldn't be possible. Or I don't know how it would be, but it seems impossible. And I point out that Cindy was a relatively small, vulnerable woman and that many of the prior incidents, including being found beaten and unconscious in a ditch miles from her home in 1985, would have been 1885, extremely difficult to self-inflict. And that ditch incident, for example, left Cindy with bruises, a stocking around her neck, and suffering from hypothermia in the middle of winter. And skeptics of the hoax idea ask, could she really have given herself those bruises or cut herself and then walked a few miles in the cold night to collapse in a random ditch? Similarly, the attack with the knife through her hand and the vicious messages seem beyond what most people would do to themselves. And there also seemed to be a consistent MO of the assailant. The fact that each attack on Cindy featured similar elements, stalkings, injections, threats, suggests a single person or group with a consistent approach, and certain bits of evidence strongly hint at someone else. Examples like the cigarette but that didn't match Cindy's brand, the strange man Tom saw outside during the fire, the 2 voice messages left on Roy's answering machine by a raspy-voiced person basically threatening Cindy's life and referencing a financial deal which was, quote-unquote, another grand after we waste her. That sounds like hitman talk, as if someone was paid to hurt her. And the blood pooling on the wrong side, like I mentioned before, of the body could suggest post-mortem movement and staging. And proponents of the murder theory often suspect Roy, considering he was her ex-husband, as the likeliest culprit, perhaps working with an accomplice. And they note that Roy had a motive, a history of controlling and abusing Cindy, possibly a desire for revenge after she left him. In that some evidence, like the hospital call with the accent that sounded like Rory's, hints at his involvement. Additionally, Roy's odd behavior, like parking behind her house at night writing long letters about the mafia, might have been a smoke and mirrors. And those in Cindy's camp believe the police were too quick to judge her and failed to seriously follow up leads that could have proven murder. And they emphasize that by labeling Cindy as not credible early on, the scamp may have missed their chance to catch her killer, effectively letting a murderer get away with it. And the simple fact that Cindy truly demonstrated that she was in fear for her safety is a seemingly large indicator that she wasn't faking it. And if she was sound enough of mind to plan a complex expression, why would she tell her family she identified a perpetrator unless that was part of a long con which seems unlikely to carry through to the grave? And her mother also reported that Cindy said the attackers threatened to kill her family if she talked, which would make sense if a real criminal was controlling her silence. But of course, this theory also has its challenges, because who is the murderer? Roy is the key subject, but was accounted for at key times, and there are no other valid suspects. And the final scene was a very public and visited area, so if it occurred elsewhere prior, how did they do so without a single trace? There was alleged history of fake reports, and there were a number of incidents that seemed a bit too much like Cindy had done them herself, including at least one instance of Cindy dialing her own number. But to this day, debate rages on, and both theories and a combination of them have staunch defenders. And the story of Cindy James continues to perplex and divide all who study it. But the coroner's inquest into Cindy's death was a pivotal moment that laid bare all aspects of the case. Because beginning in April of 1990 and concluding in May 1990, it lasted 40 days and featured testimony from over 80 witnesses, the longest coroner's inquest in provincial history at the time. And its mandate was not to find guilt, but to determine the manner of death and possibly make recommendations. So each day, the courtroom in Burnaby was filled with investigators, medical experts, friends and family of Cindy, and even Cindy's ex-husband, Roy. And the testimonies often had the feel of a high-profile trial, revealing new pieces of information and occasionally producing gasps or tears from those in attendance. And Roy's testimony was among the most dramatic. It was on the stand he went on the offensive, and he accused Cindy's family of mistreating her, claiming that Cindy's father, Otto, had physically abused her as a child, and even allegedly one of her brothers molested her. So these explosive claims stunned the courtroom, and Cindy's family vehemently denied them. And Roy also maintained that the police were trying to frame him, asserting his innocence yet again. His accusations against the Hack family, however, fed into the narrative that Cindy might have had deep-seated trauma, potentially supporting the unsexpression theory if one believed Roy's account of her past. So police and forensic experts laid out the facts of the case. Cindy's body had high levels of morphine, Valium, and fluoxetine, and they explained that while a toxicologist confirmed Cindy swallowed a large number of pills, enough fluoxetine alone to be fatal, the exact delivery method of the morphine remained undetermined. And if Cindy injected the morphine, she would have lost consciousness within minutes, making it seemingly impossible to then neatly tie herself up. And if she swallowed it, she might have had longer, perhaps about 15 minutes or more to bind herself. But that still required an incredible feat of coordination given the sedatives taking effect. And Anne's camp, not expert, Robert C. Alla, testified that he had experimented and managed to recreate the same hog tying knots on himself within about 3 minutes when sober. But this again is a knot expert. His whole job is tying knots, so no shit you can tie a knot in 3 minutes. Dude. But this demonstration was meant to show that, in theory, Cindy could have bound herself before the drugs fully incapacitated her, especially if she took pills that take a little time to absorb. However, it was a theory that jurors found hard to square with the sheer amount of drugs and the precise, tight bindings observed. Remember, it was almost to her bone, they were so tight. And further findings highlighted how perplexing Cindy's case was. Cindy's family had made some startling discoveries after her death, and her parents had found a stash of various medications in Cindy's home, including sedatives and antipositive drugs, many of which Cindy had been prescribed during her psychiatric treatment. So not completely out of the norm, but distressingly, instead of preserving these as evidence, her parents admitted they flushed the pills down the toilet, possibly not realizing their importance. So did they do it out of instinct, not wanting the media to seize on Cindy's prescriptions to paint her as crazy? Regardless of motive, that action destroyed evidence. This meant that investigators couldn't determine if Cindy had accumulated drugs to potentially use on herself. And additionally, Cindy's sister, Melanie, found a glass gutter, syringe kit, and a urinary catheter and saline solution amongst Cindy's belongings. And a glass gutter could explain how some break-ins occurred without obvious force, a small hole cut in window glass. And a syringe kit implied Cindy had means to inject drugs if she wanted to. And these items were damning in the eyes of those suspecting a hoax. They suggested Cindy might have had the tools to stage incidents. However, proponents of the foul play theory countered that these could also be a red herring or items planted to make her look bad. Testimony at the inquest also revisited Cindy's mental health evaluations, and multiple doctors who had seen Cindy over the years spoke. And Dr. Paul Termanson testified that he believed Cindy showed signs of hysterical personality disorder, which can involve attention-seeking undramatic behavior. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Wesley Friesen, said Cindy's long-term behavior fit borderline personality disorder with PTSD from earlier life trauma. Friesen even believed that Cindy harbored a tremendous amount of rage towards her father and that he suspected, without proof, that she may have been S-time. In childhood, a claim Cindy never made herself. But these psychological autopsies were meant to shed light on whether Cindy was capable of extreme actions to unsubscribe herself. The overarching picture was of a woman under severe psychological distress, but whether that distress was caused solely by internal demons or by a real stalker or both remained murky. And the scamp had to admit that, despite spending enormous resources, they were no closer to solving the mystery. And they detailed their surveillance operations and the lengths they went in order to trace calls, track Cindy's movements, and investigate leads. And some jurors reportedly grew frustrated that so much had happened, reportedly over 100 incidents, without any definitive breakthrough. And when the inquest finally ended on May 25, 1990, exactly 1 year to the day after Cindy disappeared, the jury's finding was anticlimactic, yet sadly fitting. And they categorized her death as neither murder, nor an expression, nor an accident, but as an unknown event, and it was the only honest answer given the tangle of contradictions. And this meant the case would not be pursued further unless new evidence emerged. And the scamp, in effect, closed the book on Cindy James following the inquest, and no charges were ever laid against anyone. And for Cindy's loved ones, the inquest result was bitter, and they were left with no sense of closure or any sort of justice. For investigators, it meant a professional defeat, an acknowledgement that some truths can elude even the most exhaustive inquiry. And for the public, it just cemented Cindy James's story as one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries, a case where the truth lies buried somewhere between two almost unbelievable possibilities. So in the immediate aftermath of the inquest and the official closing of the case, those closest to Cindy James struggled to pick up the pieces. And Cindy's family remained convinced that someone had literally scared her to death, and they had voiced frustration that the system had failed her. And a memorial service had been held for Cindy on June 14, 1989, just days after her body was found. And it would have been her 45th birthday. And hidden cameras were used by police at the service, discreetly filming the attendees and noting license plates, hoping that if a murderer was in their midst, he might betray himself by showing up. And Roy Makepeace notably did not attend Cindy's memorial. And if police expected the guilty party to reveal themselves at the funeral, they were disappointed because nothing obvious came of that surveillance. Not long after, the abandoned house where Cindy's body had been found was demolished in the summer of 1989. And for some, this was a relief as a grim landmark was erased. But others whispered that perhaps evidence was destroyed with it, though by then the scene had been thoroughly processed. And the Richmond community, which had been on edge during Cindy's saga, slowly returned to normalcy, but the story left a residue of unease. Neighbors who had known Cindy, or at least known of her, felt sorrow and confusion, and many could not shake the question. Had there been a dangerous predator among us that whole time, or conversely, had we harbored a troubled soul whom nobody could save from herself? And Cindy's parents, Otto and Tilly, carried their conviction of Cindy's innocence with them, and they would speak to media on occasion, always defending their daughter's character and memory. And to them, the fact that Cindy endured 7 years of terror, only to die just as she predicted by a stalker, was evidence enough of homicide. And they grieved not only the loss of their daughter, but also the painful possibility that the truth died with her. And Roy quickly faded from public view after the inquest, and a cloud of suspicion lingered around him for some, but legally he was in the clear. And reports indicate he died of natural causes years later, never having faced any charges related to Cindy's case. And friends like Agnes and Tom Woodcock carried on, but the experience left them shaken. And Agnes, who had been there for her and had tried so hard to protect her friend, expressed guilt that they couldn't do more. In interviews, she remained adamant that Cindy could not have staged the brutality she witnessed firsthand. And although the police investigation officially ended with the inquest conclusion, the investigation into Cindy James's story continued in other forms through journalism, literature, and persistent public curiosity. And in 1991, two notable books were published, each delving deeply into the case, one being The Deaths of Cindy James by Neil Holland, another being Who Killed Cindy James by Ian Mulgrew. And these books gathered interviews, evidence, and theories, presenting readers with comprehensive accounts. And Hall's work takes a more objective, fact-driven, and journalistic approach as he covered the case extensively, while Mulgrew's book takes more of the approach of advocacy, aligning with the view that Cindy was the victim of persecution and murder. But over the years, true crime television revisited the case multiple times, even internationally. And in 1989, the American EV program A Current Affair ran a profile on Cindy's unexplained disappearance in the prior stalking reports. But after Heard, the story made its way into numerous true crime magazines on news segments. Perhaps the biggest spotlight came when Unsolved Mysteries featured Cindy James's case in February of 1991. That episode, watched by many, presented the facts and interviews in a suspenseful way, asking viewers to decide, was Cindy James killed by a murderous tormentor, or had she, in effect, scared herself to death? The media tended to emphasize the uncanny elements of the story, the cut-and-paste threat notes and the bizarre voicemails left on Roy's answering machine, with someone growling threats about dead meat and wasting her. And these sordid details made for gripping headlines, and each time Cindy's story aired, it sparked a wave of interest and debate. And the internet era gave the case a new life as well. Cindy's case has been a topic of discussion on countless true crime forums and Reddit threads, where people continue to sift through the known facts, sometimes uncovering old newspaper clippings or minor details that had been overlooked. And one fascinating artifact still is the set of voicemail recordings left on Roy's machine, which were made public and have been analyzed by enthusiasts. Some claim the voice on those tapes, the dead meat messages, sound like it could actually be Cindy using a low, disguised tone, and others aren't convinced. And audio specialists have never definitively proven it either way, leaving that piece of evidence as tantalizingly ambiguous as everything else. And law enforcement occasionally received requests to look at the case again, especially when new eyes in the cold case units took an arrest. But without new forensic techniques to apply like DNA, which was not gathered in any useful form at the time since there was no obvious biological suspect evidence, there was little to be done. And Cindy's files remain in the archives of the scamp, marked as closed. And the legacy of the case also lives on in discussions about how stalking and mental health were treated historically. And some investigators privately acknowledge that if Cindy's case occurred today, it might be handled differently, with more sophisticated surveillance, psychological support, and perhaps more credence given to the possibility of an ongoing stalking scenario. Inversely, mental health experts reflect on Cindy's story in discussions of conditions like PTSD or a factitious disorder, where someone might fake victimization. Thus, Cindy James's tragedy has inadvertently educated future police, doctors, and victims advocates on the importance of staying open-minded and compassionate in complex cases. As of today, the case of Cindy James remains officially unsolved and is considered a closed investigation, unless new evidence should emerge, just as it was left at the inquest. So over 30 years later, Cindy James's case endures as a heartbreaking enigma, a reminder that sometimes the darkest mysteries remain locked away, leaving us to sift through the evidence and our own beliefs in search of answers that may never fully surface. But I would like to hear what all of you think down in the comments. This is an extremely complex case, an extremely heartbreaking case no matter what the real result is. But I would like to know what you guys think down below. Also, if you have any other cases you want me to deep dive into, let me know in the comments. I always read them, and until next time, stay safe and I will see you in the next one. Alright, bye.